few more folks will um, trickle in as we go. But I want to welcome you to the Bellarmine College of Liberal Arts in Action program. I'm the director of Engaged Learning, and along with Assistant Dean Janet Vera, who's with us, and the support of the Student Engagement and Success Committee, we're happy, really happy to welcome you. Glad to be here on this summer afternoon. The series was started last summer and features discussions with our esteemed faculty and LMU colleagues. And you can view most of the discussions that we've had thus far on the BCLA events tab under Liberal Arts in Action, and we will put the link in the chat for those of you who don't have it. Right now, we'd ask that you keep yourselves muted for a minute. Um, Dr. Park will actually be really excited to have you open up the questions after he's finished his presentation. And we can engage in a dialogue. And with that, I'd just like to say that we're excited to invite and welcome Dr. Ed Park, Professor and Chair of Asian and Asian American Studies. Professor Park has an academic background in ethnic studies and city and regional planning from the University of California at Berkeley. His research topics include migration studies, race relations, urban studies, and economic sociology. And his most recent publications have been focused on the transformation of Koreatown since the Los Angeles civil unrest of '92 and on comparative migration policies in trans-Pacific contexts. Today, he has a very interesting discussion entitled Down Payment for Real Power. Stacey Abrams, Asian Americans, and the long game of coalition politics. So help me welcome Dr. Ed Park, and I turn it over to you.
All right. Well, thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you to all of you who are presenting. And I intend to put everyone to work because this is a work in progress, and I'm sort of treating this presentation as something of a workshop. And I really look forward to your questions and your comments at the end, as Deanna said. And I'm hoping that I will really benefit from your input, and those inputs will go into making this paper better. So it's just a wonderful pleasure for me to spend this time and sharing my latest research with you. And let's get started. I learned after being at a Jesuit institution for 22 years that it's always to approach things in threes. And so I will have three, substantive slides, and we'll proceed that way. Even though this is my most current research project, like so many of my scholarly preoccupations, the beginning of this project goes way back to when I was completing my PhD and I started my professorial career. And I did that in the aftermath of Los Angeles civil unrest of 1992. And as the city was undergoing one of its most traumatic moments, I began my assistant professorship. And from that point on, I've been sort of obsessed with this question of, how do these millions of immigrants who are coming into the United States and pouring into Southern California as a gateway region, how are they being changed and transformed? And how are they changing and transforming Los Angeles, California, and the United States of America, right? And as a sociologist, one of my main, and social scientist, I'll go over a bit of the distinction here in a little bit. One of my major frustrations was that the academic fields weren't really able to capture the kind of enormous complexities that were happening as demographically America was going from this kind of a biracial country, a country of predominantly Blacks and whites, into a multiracial country that also would include Asian Americans and Latinos and so on. And so as I took my first assistant professorship, in a matter of 2 years, 2 very influential books were published that try to get a handle on, this transformation at the level of broader American society and at the level of much more sort of specific politics in Los Angeles. And I think in many ways, as I was putting this, article and this presentation together, I think these 2 books still have a lot of currency and a lot of explanatory power. And I think they still define in very profound ways the way in which, most Americans still think about American society and LA politics as we confront, multiracial realities on the ground. And so the 2 images on your left are, at the top is the book itself. It was published in 1992 as Los Angeles civil unrest was just unleashed into America. And it was written by Andrew Hacker that you see on the left. And he's a professor. He's a professor emeritus right now at Queens College in New York City. And if you ever been to Queens, you know that Queens has one of the largest Asian American community that began, in the 70s. It has a huge Latino community, and Queens College is a very, very diverse institution. But in 1992, he wrote a book called Two Nations, and he was inspired by the title of the Kerner Commission's report. And the subtitle of this book was Black and White, Separate, Hostile, Unequal, right? And he was very, very cognizant that he was writing this book 25 years after the passage of the Immigration Act of 1965. And in light of that immigration law, millions and millions of Latinos and Asian Americans came into the country. And so he took up this very serious question of, will they change the sociology of American society? And if so, how so? But his disappointing answer, disappointing to me, was this counsel, and that is, Asians and Latinos, they find themselves as spectators to a much more fundamental drama. And that drama is ultimately about how and whether African Americans and whites will be able to coexist. And so, and to politic their coexistence. And so his basic idea was that, right, until that fundamental question between Blacks and whites is settled, Asian Americans and Latinos are merely spectators who are giving witness to that more fundamental drama, right? And his idea was to bide your time until this issue is resolved, right? On the opposite coast, just a year later, after the civil unrest in LA happened, Rafe Sonnenschein, that's the nickname that he prefers, who's now the head of the Pat Brown Institute of Politics at Cal State Los Angeles, who's had a distinguished career as an observer and as an analyst of Los Angeles politics, published a book from Princeton University Press called Politics in Black and White, right? Race and Power in Los Angeles. And Rafe was almost embarrassed that he wrote a book called Politics in Black and White just a year after Los Angeles civil unrest took place, where Asian Americans and Latinos were just so profoundly implicated in that event. And so that's one of the reasons why the book came out a year late, and it has two conclusions. And one of the conclusions is politics beyond Black and white, Asian Americans and Latinos and future of LA politics. But fundamentally, Sun and Shine's, big conclusion in that second conclusion, right, that took account of LA civil unrest was that, once again, LA's political future will depend on the politics between white conservatives on the one side and the coalition between white liberals and racial minorities on the other side, right? So the fundamental drama was still very much in Black and white, right? And the big question that he had was, we all know what the position and the consolidation of white conservatism is, but the big question is whether or not white liberals and African Americans could keep their historic alliance together, right? It's the so-called Bradley Coalition, whether that Bradley Coalition will survive. And if that coalition survives, then Asian Americans and Latinos almost will have little choice but to line up behind that liberal coalition, right? And so in that conclusion, Sun and Shine justified his title of the book, that, once again, the fundamental dynamics of Los Angeles politics is the politics between Black and white liberals and African Americans, right? And that there was precious little space for Asian Americans or Latinos to have an impact in LA's political landscape, right? And so I think in many ways my, academic career has been to try and, engage this, rather, I sort of bluntly kind of dismissive understanding of where Asian Americans or Latinos fit. For my presentation today, I will just focus on the Asian American part on this. I've published some stuff, some material, some articles on that think more broadly about all of these groups, but we'll stick to the Asian American side of things and foreground that, okay? The second slide is really about sort of thinking out loud. Well, if we're going to go beyond this kind of binary understanding of race, how do we do multiracial politics in a place like Southern California, right? And what are the various kind of permutations and possibilities that we see in our political landscape, right? And in thinking about this, I think there's just kind of like three different models, right? And the final slide is all about how Stacey Abrams upturns all of this stuff and imagines a very different and radical, very, very dramatically different future in multiracial politics. I think in the first iteration of how we do multiracial politics is, for those of you who follow LA city politics, is what we've been witnessing in City Council District number 10 for the past, about 16 years or so. And so District number 10, in the sort of the colloquial kind of discussion of LA politics, has always been seen as sort of the African-American district, right? And sort of African-American representation in that district goes back a long ways. And for the last 8 years before Mark Ridley Thomas took over that seat, it was Herb Wesson, right? And Herb Wesson is a great big personality, and he defended his council seat on that very notion that this is an African American district. He's close, he is just intimately connected with African American voters, and that was his legitimating sort of claim on this seat. And for 8 of those years, he ran up against Grace Yu, who was a community activist and Korean American, and District 10 contains a significant part of Koreatown. And I think what we saw and what we continue to see in District 10 is this kind of a zero-sum game in racial politics, right? And both sides, sort of the African-American, Herb Wesson as a kind of a sort of prototype of African-American politics on the one hand, or someone like Grace Yu, kind of an upstart entrepreneurial politician, have kind of engaged in this zero-sum idea that either the seat's going to be a Black seat or the seat's going to be a Korean seat. And once the demographic tips over, then it will revert to a Korean American council member, right? And so, over the years, there's been very little discussion of how this seat could serve a greater political vision that would include African Americans and Asian Americans. And the truth of the matter is now the plurality of the residents being Latino, right? And so I'm using, City Council District 10 as perhaps one of the most common examples of how demographic changes impact racial and ethnic politics. And that is as a zero-sum game, that if one group has it, then the other group doesn't. And it just simply is a kind of a football that gets passed around. And the group that has it means that they have it totally without sharing, without thinking beyond their ethnic interest, right? Obviously, people like Grace Yu and Herb Wesson would be appalled at what I just said, right? No politician thinks that they're representing only their narrow interest. But I think any fair appraisal of their campaigns in the last 12 years any fair reading of it would make somebody come to that conclusion. So I'll die on that sword. The second idea is, or second version, is what we saw in California's 29th district. And so 29th district is where Fullerton is. It's North Orange County, sort of the center of Orange County conservatism. And that seat was held by Ed Royce for a very long time. As all of you know, in Orange County, there's lots of demographic changes with lots of interesting flipping of the partisan status of those folks. And what Ed Royce and the Orange County Republican Party saw was that the demographic changes were were reflected in political changes as well. And so this district, which would have been unimaginable, right, for the presidential election in 2016, it voted for Hillary Clinton, right? And so it lit the fire under the shoes of Republicans, and they decided that, Ed Royce decided that he would retire, and that in order for Republicans to hold that seat, they needed to play identity politics. And the way it decided to do that was to push a Korean American candidate, Young Kim, to hold a torch for the Republican Party and to pit the Asian American community in that district against the Latino community, which is plurality of the residents in that district, right? And so what happened in 2018 is that Young Kim loses in a very, very close election to Gil Cisneros, who's Latino, but that district is fundamentally, I think, still somewhat of a conservative district, right? And so without a Herculean campaign, which was the case in 2018 to 2020, excuse me, Young Kim was elected, and she now holds that seat, right? And so what version 2 says is that you have a Asian American woman, congresswoman, and she steps up to Ed Royce's seat. However, that is driven by this demographic necessity on the part of the Republican Party, who through all this polling finds that the candidate who would most excite the conservative voters would be an Asian American woman, and they need to slop off a big chunk of Asian American voters in order to hold on to that seat, right? And so this idea is that is kind of identity politics by necessity and in face of demographic change, okay? The final version in this slide is a fascinating story of Yvonne Burke and David Ryu. And Yvonne Burke is, I think, one of the most consequential politicians in all of California. And she's a Democratic African-American politician, most famous probably in the state of California as a county supervisor for LA County. And what Yvonne Burke has done throughout her career has been to use her office as a resource to give voice to these communities that lack voice, right? And so the person that Yvonne Burke is paired up with is David Ryu, who as a brand new graduate of UCLA undergraduate, Yvonne Burke saw how desperate the Korean American community was after the civil unrest and didn't have much of a political voice. And so Yvonne Burke hired David Ryu to give his first job as an aide to her. And his job was to work with the Korean American community and represent that community in the post-civil unrest political changes, right? And I don't think she anticipated that 20-some years down the line, that helping hand that she extended to David Ryu would translate into David Ryu becoming the first, Korean American to become a city council member. And that happened, after the 20th anniversary of LA civil unrest, which was like a monumental moment for the Korean American community. And Yvonne Burke would always, have a cherished place in Korean American politics for this selfless, generous role that she played, right? But I think what was interesting about Yvonne Burke's, relationship with David Ryu was that she did not do this as a political act, right? She did not do this as a part of, conscious part of of supporting somebody who would have political aspirations and candidacy and impact LA politics. As is her nature, I think she did this as a way to once again, extend a hand to a Korean American community that was desperate for some kind of political access, right? I think in some ways it's this kind of principled politics, but devoid of this kind of partisan organizing strategic kind of an idea, okay? The final slide that I will go to, and if you have questions, we could go back to some of this, and that is Stacey Abrams and the politics of New Georgia. And so, I'm sure all of you remember the Atlanta spa shooting that happened on March, of this year. And I'm sure all of you remember the mayor of Atlanta holding that press conference, and there were, that's a white sheriff who claimed that there was no hate crime intent for this event. And Mayor Bottoms, very famously intervened and said, we do not know that. And it will take time, and she will spare no resource to investigate this incident, and so on. What I want to say is that for many, many Asian Americans, when that press conference was held and there were no Asian Americans in the podium, I think all of us felt this precarity of silence again, right? And I think this is something that immigrant folks immediately understand after a great big event that happens, and they're not part of the speeches that frame what just happened, right? And so I think there was a moment in which Asian American community was in crisis. It's like, are there going to be Asian American voices who understand what happened, and will they speak up, right? But just literally minutes after that press conference, what everyone in the world or everyone in the country found out was that indeed, in Georgia, Asian Americans are punching way above their weight in electoral politics, right? And so no less than, 4 members of Georgia's House of Representatives and Senate came up. Sam Park was just an eloquent spokesperson who, framed this issue in the broader history of race in America. Bee Nguyen was also eager to speak on the gendered aspects of this and the particular ways in which Asian American women are gendered and victimized by misogynistic and racist discourse and so on. Now, and it also included, newly elected members like Michelle Au and Marvin Lim. Marvin Lim would be the first Filipino American to be elected. Bee Nguyen would be the first Vietnamese who served in Georgia legislature. Sam Park would be the very first Asian American gay man who openly served in Georgia. And what was interesting about all of this, for those of us who are kind of nerdy enough to follow Georgia politics, was that we knew that all 4 of them shared something. And what they shared was their intimate connection to Stacey Abrams, right? And so how intimate was it? Sam Park was on staff of Stacey Abrams, both in her campaign and when she was serving as a state legislature. And it was, in fact, Stacey Abrams who encouraged Sam to run for public office. Bee Nguyen was somebody who had an intimate role in Stacey Abrams' campaigns, and because of their common connection, Bee Nguyen was the campaign chair for Sand Park, right? And Michelle O and Marvin Lim, both of their political careers were, just profoundly impacted and shaped by Abrams' support. So in many ways, they all belong to House of Abrams in Georgian politics, right? Without her, it's really hard to imagine this big, cadre of Asian American politicians who would impact not just the narrative of Atlanta spa shooting, but fundamental aspects of Georgian politics going forward, right? Bee Nguyen she's currently running for Secretary of State, a position that is hugely important, right? As Georgia enacts all these voting
Anita Wells
laws.
Join the meeting.
Okay. Now, what I want to raise is, in addition to these cadre of Asian American voters, in what ways did Stacey Abrams rethink race and coalition politics, right? And I'll just lay out these 4 points and get to the discussion. The first point is that from the very beginning, Abrams, her participation in electoral politics in Georgia had this very interesting principle of there are no spectators in Georgia, right? And so before a lot of Americans knew about Stacey Abrams, Koreans knew about her because she translated her campaign websites into Korean language. And people were befuddled by this because Koreans were so few, they constituted such tiny number of voters in her district. But her idea was that even if there's one voter in her district, she owes it to them to make the political process available, right? And, and that was, I think, a very interesting sort of idea, a politician that emphasizes that there is no threshold in which a community is worthy of outreach or is included in the political discussion. Just by being there is enough, right? The second idea is that the Democratic Party, and in a very affirmative way, the African American political leadership must fight for Asian American political support. And that is, if Asian Americans should not be spectators to Georgia's politics, politicians who are running for office should not be spectators to the ethnic political formation of people in their states, right? And so, so African Americans have then, the political leaders have an affirmative responsibility to win their support, right? The third idea is the idea that Asian American community, despite the tendency to render them in a homogeneous way, that there are profound partisan divide in that community, right? And for both parties then, the imperative is to recognize that divide and compete to win the community, or maybe a better way of putting it is to win the support of all the people that you could win and bring them to your side, right? And so that's a very important point. The photo here, bottom right is Sam Lee, and then bottom left is Bree Nguyen, and the serious looking man on the top right is the kind of a nightmare for Stacey Abrams that I think really urged her to to reach out to Asian American and Korean American community. And the media has misreported that Sam Park is the first Asian American politician to be elected to the legislature, and that is not correct. The first person is actually B.J. Pak, and B.J. Pak was elected in 2011 in the neighboring district where Sam Park is elected, and he's an arch conservative Republican who throughout his 8 years in Georgia legislature received 100% approval from the American Conservative Union, right? And so what's interesting, the juxtaposition is you have B.J. Pak on one hand, Sam Park on the other. You probably could not imagine two more different politicians in America. But the truth of the matter is that in Georgia, there are first two Koreans to be elected to the legislature, right? All of that to say then, these communities are divided politically, and at the same time, it's up to political leaders to win over these communities to their side, right? And so I think that's what Stacey Abrams really understood, that African Americans, as well as the Democratic Party, could not afford to be spectators to this drama of political formation that was taking place in these communities. Okay, the brilliant genius of Stacey Abrams, though, is that she decided she was going to choose who would run in these communities, and that is to have the presence and the wherewithal to reach out to Sam Park, who had volunteered to her campaign in the state legislature, and say, why don't you just not campaign, but run for public office, or to win, right? And so, in other words, this is a remarkable story of how Stacey Abrams identified political talent in these communities, gave them the first start in their journey to become a political leader, and to use all of her political resources that were fostered within the African American community to share that resource, get these folks elected, and in the process, bring us to a transformative possibility in Georgia politics. Okay. All right, I think I'll just end here, and then if you have any questions or comments, we could move forward. But before I do that, I have no illusion that this is a unique story, a story that I picked because after all the stuff that we've been through, we need some inspiration. And this is really a story of possibility. But if people could pull this off in Georgia, certainly we could produce many, many stories like this here in California. Okay, I'll end here. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us. Brought up lots of interesting points and lots of thoughts swirling around. Are there questions that you have? And some of you might have, well, let me start there. Are there any questions that people have that want to bring up? They want to bring up now? Comments? So Professor Park mentioned at the beginning that he's still working on this and would love feedback and thoughts and wants to kind of workshop this a bit. if you have questions, some of you might have noticed that Dr. Grills, Cheryl Grills, was here with me and had to leave. However, she left me with a series of questions and topics, as she would. So I'll start with one of hers, and then as things sort of bubble up, I know I take a moment to have to think of my own, but I want to start with this one because I think this would be very interesting as well. To what extent might unresolved racial tensions between African American and Asian Americans be a factor to be addressed moving forward, and what might that look like moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think right. So the tensions that that I think Cheryl is referring to might be sort of the Black Korea tension that in many ways contributed to like the civil unrest of 1992 and so on. Yeah, I think what is interesting about sort of within the progressive, within some of the cross-racial organizing that's happened is precisely to foreground the ways in which both Asian American community and African American communities are, divided politically, right? And so I think for a lot of people, instead of trying to reach like a common ground, if that common ground means that we view African American communities and say Korean American community as monolith, that they have like conscious thought, like a political agenda, that they could come to a common understanding, that we kind of forfeit those kinds of possibilities in exchange for identifying those folks who are, let's say, progressively minded on racial politics and forging this new set of relationships, right? And so I think one of the reasons why Stacey Abrams was able to reach out to the Asian American community and have this moment, maybe, is that Atlanta's Black and Asian relationship does not have this hangover of those previous events, and it allowed them to like reimagine and start from the position of both of our communities are diverse. What is the African American part of that community that could work on things like voting rights and economic inequality, and what are those parts in the Asian American community that also share those concerns, right? And so I think the idea here is that more than the reified racial politics, what you foreground is public policy issues, political ideology, sort of substantive policy concerns. And then you see how, you build then this sort of coalition of willing that cuts across these racial boundaries, right? And so, and that's, I think, been a, one of the most intractable ideas behind racial politics in America, right? And so what is the intractable idea? The intractable idea is that are racial groups like entities that could cohere around politics so that these communities come into some sort of agreement over A, B, and C? Or are racial groups really like ideal types? They're just kind of a shorthand for a very complex set of social belonging. But in reality, and especially when politics happens, because there's a election outcome that you either win or lose, you have to see things with clear set of eyes. Or is the reality then these racial categories are ideal types, and what is more important might be the set of policy concerns and policy outcomes and those sorts of things, right? And so I think as an academic, I'm always intrigued by how both of these assertions coexist, and depending on historical time or depending on the personality of political leadership, it seems like different sides get their way in different moments, right? And I think that's why like leadership matters, right? And somebody like Stacey Abrams is fascinating because no one doubts that she's pushing for African-American political interest. Yet at the same time, she has been so profoundly willing to share African-American political power. And I think the long game of it is that people like Yvonne Burke and Stacey Abrams sees that as a form of investment, right, in these communities, because, you know, demographically, if you're just sort of taking crass political, crass political outcomes, and you're foregrounding that, you know, Georgia obviously is such a competitive state. African-American community can't afford to have an electorate, like 3.5% of the electorate become people like BJ Puck that you see on the screen, right? And so, you know, I think that might be the other kind of consideration.
Okay, great. We've got a series of questions now. So I'm going to start with the one I saw first, which was Jenny, who asked, do you see this multiracial coalition building is needed for 22 for the Democratic Party, and do you think it's happening with the Republican Party as well? Then I'll go to Anita Cook-Wells.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, especially here in California, the Republican Party has decided that without winning some support from Asian American and Latino voters, they will never come out of the political wilderness, and they will just lose statewide seats every single cycle, right? And the way that is happening is right out of the playbook of people like Yvonne Burke and Stacey Abrams, and that is they're, you know, reaching out to younger Asian Americans, and they're putting them on their legislative team. They're hiring them as their deputies, and so, you know, there's that going on. If you look at the presidential election, I mean, you know, there are just so many districts where the races are just so incredibly tight. I think Asian Americans and Latinos play a big role as swing voters. And so I think we're going to see that in, you know, many different sort of manifestations. What I am most concerned about is, of course, people manipulating multiracial coalition building in a very cynical sort of way, right? And by pitting groups against one another, right? And so if Stacey Abrams' sort of approach has been to try and inspire young Asian American activists to live up to certain sort of important principles of inclusiveness and fairness, surely I think there are many other people who are doing that to appeal to racist fears and narrow racial interest. And so, but, you know, the fact of but the truth of in both of the cases is that I think both parties realize that they can't be spectators to Asian American and Latino political formations, right? And I think we just see so many interesting examples of that reality.
Great. So Anita Cook Wells, this is my sister, has a question. But thank you for that response. You're muted. You're muted.
I apologize, Professor Park, because I joined late, and if you already answered this question, you know, there's not need, you know, it's not necessary to answer it again. But what do you see as the difference between, say, the Asian American and African American community in Atlanta, which to me seems sort of, or in Georgia rather, not necessarily just in Atlanta, but which probably is smaller and less diverse than what you're going to see in California? I mean, how does the model that you're talking about really work when you're dealing with a Korean American community that's the size that it is, and an African American community that's the size that it is? Whereas I guess I see Georgia as being somewhat more discrete and manageable.
Yeah. Yeah, I actually think that what Atlanta has been able to accomplish in terms of, so I'm going to be just sort of laying my partisan hat down. So as somebody who is, you know, a Democrat and progressive and all of that, I think you could really make the argument that Atlanta's Korean American community should have been mission impossible for the Democrats to win over, right? Because as you said, the Korean American community in Atlanta is very much a suburban community of professionals and small business people. And one could argue that if you were to sort of deploy a kind of a survey of partisanship, that they would be likely to be Republican and conservative, right? And I think when BJ Pak won his seat, I think that was the big sort of sentiment that indeed, just 10 years ago, all the articles were about, oh, Asian Americans are swing voters in Georgia, and this means that Republicans are going to have power for a very long time, right? And so, so I think, you know, good for Stacey Abrams to win those folks over, right? And like I said, I think the reason why Stacey won those folks over was to provide both material political help, right? In other words, putting Asian American activists on her staff, making sure that this is not a part-time youthful activity, engaging in politics, and then they go on to do something else, right? By giving them an avenue to make this a vocation for them. She gave these people legs. And by emphasizing the substantive sort of policy issues, kind of the meat and butter or rice and kimchi issues, if you will, she was able to win these folks over. I think one of my favorite ideas is that, you know, Bree Nguyen's father is a Vietnamese refugee, ardent, you know, conservative, but when he saw how, you know, Bree was treated by the Democratic Party and the issues that they brought to bear, you know, he famously switched his political allegiance and that sort of thing. So I think the idea is that you can't win folks over until you engage them, right? And so that's that idea. I think here in Los Angeles, the reason why the African American and Korean American politics became at such loggerheads was because people literally thought in 1990 that there was such a thing as Korean American community, that they all agreed on whatever politics that the leaders were expressing. And they saw these communities as monolithic, right? And so the Democratic Party never foregrounded any issues other than maybe like issues of foreign policy or like the symbolic politics that they thought would, capture all Korean Americans in some way. And ditto with African American community. And so I think by having, what I would consider kind of an essentialist understanding of race, meaning that all Koreans are this way, all Koreans, own liquor stores and they throw change at their customers, or that, that just made it, I think, that made it impossible for a more kind of a nuanced understanding of how, 500,000 Korean Americans living in Southern California will make their way into, American politics, right? And I think both parties made that mistake, which means, I think, today, Korean American community remains, politically divided, and I think both parties, I think, finally realize that what they need is more than an ethnic message. They need a policy message. In an interesting way, they need to de-racialize electoral politics if they're going to be able to win certain percentage of Korean American community to their partisan fold, is how I sort of see it, I think.
Thank you. We have a couple more questions, but I know we're running out of time. I want to at least get one more in, which asks about, is there an Asian American partisan divide also separated by generations? Or is the Asian American partisan divide also separated by generations? Get that one in, and if people can stay a little longer for after that question, then maybe we can get to our final.
Yeah, I mean, I think by and large that there is slight partisan divide. And it also depends on the specific ethnic communities, right? And so I think among Korean Americans and Vietnamese Americans, it's a well-known partisan divide where the immigrant generation tends to be much more conservative than the second generation. But for other communities, that's not necessarily true, right? And I think, I think because of the presidency of Donald Trump and before that, other Republican presidents who had pretty sort of negative politics on immigration and so on. Healthcare is another big driver of Asian American partisanship, which is kind of an interesting idea. I think right now, Asian Americans heavily lean toward the Democratic Party. But I think this is a community whose political formation is still in that formative stage. And I think it's up to each of the parties to make their case. And it's a very, very, I guess in sales language, it's a very gettable population, right? And I think, Stacey Abrams really showed that in Georgia, right? And this is a community in many ways that is just desperate for that kind of outreach and messaging as to why they should participate and in the terms in which they should participate.
Great. Well, I know our time is up. So if people do need to leave at this point, I want to thank Dr. Park to bring up lots of interesting points. I have some takeaways, but I won't go through them. If you can stay a minute, I don't know, Professor Park, if you have a couple of minutes, yes, I will ask our dean. I'll give our dean the final question, and we'll go ahead and answer that. But thank you so much for being here. Dean Crabtree says, as you think about the annual Interethnic Relations Surveys component of Study LA's public opinion poll, How do you think those data reflect a continuing set of phenomenon related to your research? And in what ways do you think public opinion polls actually shape opinion?
Yeah, I'm actually, as a sociologist who's interested in politics and not the other way around, I think public surveys are very heavily affected by events that happen to us like closely, right? And so there's this kind of bias of the latest sort of news and that sort of thing. What I look for is the way in which political leadership engages and integrates and includes these different communities into their staff, into their campaigns, in their policy messaging, and so on. And so I'm much more interested in behaviors and outcomes of inclusion and exclusion, rather than like the public policy, rather than public surveys of taking the temperature at very specific moments, right? I guess, I'm partly this way because I think if we were to take into account like the LA civil unrest of 1992, or the more recent George Floyd killing and all the political protest that happened, in American racial politics, what we're moved by are these external shocks to the system. And then public opinion will whiplash from here and there. What remains true, though, is that if you built institutional ties, if you have interpersonal relationships among community-based organizations or elected leaders in community-based organizations, if those things are strong, I think then the city is much more resilient, right, than what public surveys often capture about, how's race relations in Los Angeles or that sort of thing. So, I think sort of that's one answer. I think the other answer is that I think what's very interesting about Los Angeles is the generational thing. And so we talked a little bit about the partisan political divide among generations in the Asian American community, both in terms of public surveys and in behavior. What is very, very true is that younger Angelenos have much thicker connections across racial and ethnic lines than even slightly older Angelenos. And so, this is not to self-congratulate the work that we do at LMU and, that sort of thing. But I do think in a very serious way that all the efforts that, not just academics, of course, but all the efforts that's been made across different institutions here in California, right, to get sort of younger folks to appreciate the importance of diversity, to get students into these spaces where they engage each other in a more, social and interpersonal settings. I think that has just, that really shows up in both survey of, people's affinity groups and their participation, and also in organizational memberships to political organizations and so on. And so, I'm really, despite the way I come off sometimes, I'm really a glass is half full kind of guy. And I think that's just, I think, one of the outcomes of decades of focus on race relations and racial conflict and conflict resolution, and much more aspirational ideas of, forging a more just and more perfect union, has paid off, right? And I think, but I think we need to go beyond this kind of Democratic Party, if I could be kind of more political and partisan about, we need to go beyond this kind of feel-good messaging on the part of the Democratic Party. I think what we really need to do is really sort of deliver on, policy outcomes, and whether that's like loan forgiveness or expansion of healthcare or those sorts of things. Otherwise, we leave ourselves very, very vulnerable to Republicans who will hammer, just the impossibility of coexistence. And I think that's the thing that worries me the most, right? And we have like rich history in Southern California, like, right? For like a lot of my students, they can't imagine that at one point, all the statewide offices were held by Republicans, and that the state passed anti-affirmative action and, Proposition 187 and 209. And so while we might feel comforted by, way things look partisan-wise in California, I would say if you just have a little bit of historical perspective, I'm just afraid that the pendulum will swing the other way, and way the pendulum swings in California is very profound and very severe.
That is a great point. So I'm going to jump in and say and ask everyone to thank Dr. Park for this really important and interesting discussion. We've had some great topics, and I'm reading that Dean Crabtree is saying, wholly engaging our students and wholly engaging even the small group has been really great. So I appreciate you all for joining us, and we thank you. This will be our last Liberal Arts in Action for this summer. I want to thank Janet Vera, Katie, and just because I want to call it, I'm blanking on the last name, and Allison Bullitt for supporting us during this work in the Dean's office, and obviously Robin Crabtree, our Dean. So thank you, and we will let you know when the next one comes around.
Okay. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.